Hello, and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers with whatever writing ailments you might have.
Whether it's related to your craft or your career, we can help.
Are you ready for your session?
The doctors are in. Welcome to Writers Group Therapy. Today we have David Scott Hay on our podcast. David is known for his unique tone and distinctive prose. His past work includes experimental speculative fiction and horror novel NSFW, satirical literary novel The Fountain, and award-winning screenplays and plays. As a screenwriter, David wrote the screenplay for the 2006 film Hard Scrambled that won Best Drama at the Garden State Film Festival. Welcome to the show, David.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. I've written some horror, and I've been a horror too, Roshni, at times, I think. But other than yeah, I have sometimes. No, but I'm interested in your writing. We'll talk about some of the horror aspects and the books you've written. But we always like to start with kind of your writer's journey. Like, how did you start writing, and how did you get to where you are now?
All right, we'll do the quick summary. It's interesting. When I was younger, I was born and raised in Oklahoma, so always knew I wanted to be in the arts. Always knew I was interested in film. Always knew I was interested in storytelling. But I was from Oklahoma, right? So at that time, there was no industry. Toner Hillerman was the only author of note that I can recall. And I would read a bunch of biographies of other writers, like, what was their path? How do you do it? Do I get to the mailroom and work my way up? And every single biography I read of somebody's journey was so completely unique that at times it felt really daunting. You're just like, well, I can't replicate that path. But then at one point I realized, oh, my path is going to be unique as well. So I've still got a chance. And that was that kind of sustained me early on, but it was also, you've got to make a move. We had I was, in Oklahoma. I had an opportunity to move to San Antonio to open up a comic book store of all things with a buddy of mine from high school. Did that for a couple of years, and then I had a chance meeting with a theater student. I had done theater in high school and kind of forgotten all about it. I'd moved on to writing novels. I had an agent had a junior agent at a big agency. So I thought, my career is made here. This is how it goes. That ended up not working out. And I met this theater student, and he was looking for new works to direct and asked if I'd ever written a play. And at the time, writing a 90-page script as opposed to a 400-page, novel seemed like a really fun challenge without too big of a commitment. And long story short, we produced that play. I used an insurance check from a little fender bender with my 67 Caddy.
Wow.
And yeah, it's $1,500. And in San Antonio, that's enough to put up a show. And we did. And I got the theater bug. We did one more show in San Antonio, won a couple of shiny things. So that was very encouraging. And one of the critics was like, this would translate well to film or TV. And I kept that in the back of my head. And then we moved to Chicago, and we did the grind, the off-loop theater grind, for a number of years. Finally broke through, so we were getting ink. We did a couple of my shows, and then I started producing other people's shows. I would go to readings and see these plays and think this needs to be put up. So I became kind of a producer in Chicago as well.
There's lots of little theaters in Chicago.
Yeah, when I was there, tons of off-loop theater. That scene was so vibrant and amazing. Of course, you have the bigger regional theaters like the Court and Northlight and Steppenwolf there. And I think I built sets for all of them. I was mostly doing scenic carpentry there for a time. And then I adapted my play Hard Scrambled into a screenplay. And here's the funny thing, and this is why people, when they ask about my journey and I start telling them, they're like, yeah, I can do that. And then I tell them this. I entered a screenplay contest in the back of Creative Screenwriting magazine. They wanted a low budget, no effects screenplay. And I thought, oh, they're looking for a play, and they're not looking for a horror play because there's no special effects. So I sent it in, and I was one of the, 5 winners or whatever. And a couple of years later, 9/11 happened shortly thereafter, so everything got put on hold. Um, we shot the movie. I directed it out here, and spent a couple of years in post, did a little bit of reshoots, and eventually I moved out to California because the Chicago winters were too much. I had plenty of friends that had moved out here, friends that I had made, and I moved out here and started pursuing screenwriting, and then insert a bunch of other things happened after that.
And a bunch of other things happened. Yeah.
That's part one. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So you gravitate towards speculative fiction, horror. Why did you move in that direction with your writing?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, with The Fountain, which I had actually written years before it got published, and that ended up being my grad school thesis. That idea had come to me just in a flash at an art museum. It was kind of like a what if scenario, and I just couldn't shake I was really curious about how that would play out. So that ended up being a 6-year journey to write that book, because I gave myself no deadlines and no I would wait till I was inspired, which is usually opposite of acid chair, black on white, that I try to do. But not safe for work. Once The Fountain got picked up, which was, I got the yes a day before, the big 5-0, right? And, I was so glad that it was going to get published. It was with an indie publisher I really liked. I'd heard a lot of good things about. They were putting out quality work. And then I realized, oh my God, she may want a follow-up book. And I didn't have a follow-up novel. So, in a fit of like, I've got to write something else, I started Not Safe for Work, which started as a completely different book. And then I started reading about these social media moderators that were, having PTSD. And I thought, oh, that's a good meet cute. And this was right at the beginning of the pandemic too. So a lot of things were on my mind in terms of, social media, interconnected, technology versus nature. And once I kind of happened upon that kind of meet cute scenario, I was kind of like, okay, what would it be like to actually work there? And what would you do to cope with it? And there's a little bit of a, satirical edge to it as well. So I could really push the boundaries of what, happens in there. But it's been interesting to see the response to that book. So I didn't set out to write like a speculative fiction horror. It was just a lot of things that were kind of going through my mind at the time, and my son had just been diagnosed with a couple of mental health issues, and that's under control now, thank God. But that was 2 weeks in the pandemic, during lockdown. So, and as anybody that's ever dealt with anybody on medication knows that is a long turnaround to see if something is effective or not.
Yeah, I've got a nephew, and from a lot of people in my family are on antidepressants, let's say.
Yeah. So, I didn't set out to write a horror book. And actually, when we were done, and my publisher called me, she's like, "I'm halfway through, but yes, I want it. It's giving me nightmares." I was like, "Great." And then we kind of like, how are we going to market this? Because my publisher, Whiskey Tick, they do avant-garde, they do experimental, they do stuff that's not in the mainstream, and this had a little bit of an experimental form to it. But it was like, how do we market this? It's not full-on satire, but I was like, well, it's kind of horror adjacent, right? Even though, like Kirk has called it science fiction, and the speculative thing came back. I was like, I let's go with the horror folks. They seem really voracious readers, are really open to really kind of weird and bizarre stuff. And that's how we ended up on the marketing side.
That is really cool. So wait, going back a little bit, was your book kind of like a response to what was happening with the pandemic and your son, like a sort of cathartic kind of thing, or was it just completely that just happened to be happening at the time?
I think that just happened to be happening. The original idea was completely different. I was 30,000 words into that novel, and knew I was just generating material, right? Could be used for somebody's backstory, bar stories. the whole thing. Um, that kind of meet cute thing, the social media moderators have to survive. They're temps. They have to survive the first 90 days to get healthcare insurance, right? Uh, and meanwhile, there's this, sinister thing that keeps popping up, that, leading up to this big event that they're kind of a witness to. Um, and that seemed that I could, incorporate. I was gorging myself on Reddit. I was reading politics. I was reading tech stuff. Um, I think it was just the things that were going on in my head. Uh, but it just so happened to coincide with the pandemic. So there's a moment where I realized I had stopped working on the book for a while because the two social media moderators, spoiler alert, they end up kind of isolating themselves in their apartment. They turn into a big terrarium, right? They lay sod, they put up trees, they they only have a TV VCR unit to watch old children's movies, and they have a jellyfish, right? So they're really withdrawing from tech, right? And I realized that I couldn't escape in my writing because I was writing about people that were isolating while we were isolating. And that that like dawned on me, in the middle of that. And I really kind of had to push through and just kind of, put on my professional hat and finish editing because there was no real uh, escape from that, especially early on when people are wiping down groceries and you're dealing with medication adjustment and doctors, appointments over Zoom. It just gets everything suddenly feels so much more heightened and disconnected at the same time, which just heightens that feeling of isolation.
So on the other end of the spectrum, you talking about techno futuristic horror. The book you're working on now, The Butcher of Nazareth, is a speculative historical fiction, literally set at biblical times. Can you talk a little about that? Because you don't usually you think about the Bible as its own kind of horror story in some respects, but
Sure. Yeah.
and I found the introduction very interesting because you talk about how the person who wrote your foreword was talking about how some schools of thought think of the Old Testament as just as a prequel to the New Testament, and
Right.
that very modern thinking about that time of history.
Yeah. Dave Fitzgerald, who wrote Troll, which is probably one of the funniest, most profane books I've read in years. We've become buddies, and he was kind enough to write the introduction. And it's always fun when somebody writes an introduction and you read it and they're like, okay, yeah, they get it, or they make connections that you don't, and you're like, wow, okay, well, that's fair game. But this one came about because I'd spent so much time online in the tech world, reading white papers, reading foundations of geopolitics, that kind of outline. So many things in not safe for work come from online. Different videos, different everything. What they're ingesting, how they're dealing with this. The temp situation where everybody goes to a contract or gig working. And I thought, man, I can't go back to that world. I really can't. Um, and I'm kind of an experimentalist. Like I'd like to try different genres and what's my take on a certain thing. So The Butcher of Nazareth, which is I would say a much more serious literary, horror endeavor, actually was conceived as, get this, a cozy mystery with Mary Magdalene as the sleuth.
Get out, I'm trying to figure out how that would work. That's cool, though. But a
Well,
cozy? A
I was
cozy, really?
I was gonna write a cozy. Yeah, I looked up, how to outline. I bought a couple, and I just thought, "Oh, I've never written one of those. What would that look like?" And part of the joke is doing the Will Ferrell thing, where you're gonna do something completely unexpected and play it straight, right?
Mhm.
But I would use biblical characters because at some point in the Bible, Joseph like walks off stage and is never mentioned again. So I was like, great, I'll kill Joseph, and that'll be, I can. That'll be the he'll be the murder victim, and then we'll spend some time getting to know the folks in Nazareth and the suspects.
Poor
So
Joseph.
I know, and it was it was jokingly titled Nazareth Fine Furniture and Catering, right?
Oh my gosh, that's
As just a
awesome.
joke to me, as a joke to me. I don't know if it would ever survive, and I may write that book someday. But how it ended up flipping was I was writing a list of suspects, and who could hate Joseph? Why would they hate him? Blah 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 blah. And my wife mentioned, she's like, because she was raised Catholic, she's like, well, when King Herod found out, about the wise men and the birth of Jesus, he sent a bunch of assassins to kill all the newborns, 2 and under. And I was like, great, okay, this assassin realizes he failed at his job. Jesus is still alive, and he's gonna hunt him down, and he kills Joseph by mistake or to lure him out. Or I was like, okay, great, okay, that was suspect number 8. And then I got down to like 10 or 12 suspects, and I went back and I looked at my list, and I was like, oh, number 8, that's the story. Like, I'm curious as to how somebody goes along with that, what they've been doing the last 30 years, what is driving them now. How would that look in terms of, a story be told between the lines of the Bibles? Because there's no real revisionist like Tarantino kind of ending, right? There's none of that. Like, how do you play? And I was really curious about that. So despite having started on the cozy mystery, I kind of put it aside, and I started working on this one, and it turned into kind of a literary horror, historical fiction, however you want to pitch it. And I was quite thrilled with how it came out. And I also loved writing at a time when there were not cell phones, there were not cars, there was absolutely zero tech. You had the wheel, you had fire, and and agriculture, and barter basically. And so that's where I ended up.
Where do you come up with your ideas? And because you're along a wide spectrum of
Yeah.
time, that you don't pigeonhole yourself into a certain period, obviously. But where do you come up with the ideas? And
Oh yeah, no, with the butcher, I knew I'd had some support from the horror community, and I actually served as a juror for the Horror Writers Association a couple of years ago for short stories. And I committed myself to a year of reading hundreds and hundreds of short stories, and I got to discover some really good writers. In fact, of the ones that didn't make it to the final ballot, Miette and I actually started a horror imprint called Headless. And this summer we'll actually be putting out an anthology of all those, 20, 25 stories that I read that I really responded to. Because I told her, I said, look, horror folks are voracious, and it's a good audience, and they're good word of mouth, and they love to share. And it's just a wonderful community. So when I was writing The Butcher of Nazareth, I was, how horror do I want to go? I didn't want to go splatterpunk, but I wanted to, have moments like you said. The Bible is very violent. There's a lot of sex and violence in the Bible. So, how to pace that out, and we call it literary horror because, there's, a few scenes, but it's what would you call a slow burn because you're dealing with the historical stuff, and it's really one man's, journey. So, I wanted to make sure that I had horror elements in there that we could kind of lean that way marketing. And that sounds, cynical, but that's the nature of it, right? You want your book to be read. You want people to, respond to it. And, people that have a predilection for reading horror, have a really wide range of horror that they will read. So that's how I kind of decided to start, Headless with Miette, and to put the butcher in kind of that literary horror, historical horror, biblical horror, and I don't even know that that's a subgenre that exists. But the people that I've talked to that I've pitched the book to, they all, because you never know if people are interested in any kind of religious story, that has Jesus or a butcher or, Bethlehem or anything in there. And I was kind of surprised at how many people were like, oh yeah, this is right up my alley. Like, I was raised in this church, or I'm a lapsed Catholic. So it's interesting that I think that there might be a wider audience for it than I initially thought or hoped, but we'll see.
yeah, the faith-based market is interesting. And they're not always the faith-based people that are interested in it, because there's a hesitancy to criticize, the establishments. And I actually have a project I'm working on now that had some, we're rewriting it, and it had some issues where it was supposed to be a faith-based audience, but there were too many criticisms of the church and too many characters that weren't represented as, as positive as you would like, some negative characters in the church, and we didn't want to turn off the audience. So how do you feel about writing something that's maybe going to be felt contrary to canon, so to speak?
Well, that's a great question.
Cool.
It's a great question. I mean, how do I feel about it? I want people to read it. I want people to experience it and then kind of judge for themselves. Like I said, I kind of play between the lines. You talk about the nativity. I have two versions of the nativity story because a lot of stuff, the Bible is written very summary. So you just kind of gloss over, what it's like. I mean, imagine being, Mary, she's what, 14, she's pregnant, Joseph is, not convinced she's actually carrying, the son of God. And, they haven't consummated their marriage yet. She's freaking out. They're in a stable. There's animals freaking out as well. And I introduce a midwife to help him. And she plays a integral part of the, book one or part one of the story. And none of it runs against what's in the Bible. And I think I did that very deliberately because I didn't want people hitting chapter 2 or part and going, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I did a ton of research to try to make sure culturally it was right, that it kind of followed along the lines of the Bible too, but you're really kind of expanding certain sections and areas. It's kind of like Citizen Kane, that you have, the butcher is basically trying to track down Jesus, and he meets the midwife, 30 years later. He meets the Pharisee that taught Christ when he was, a teenager before, after they came back from, fleeing to Egypt. And then you go to Nazareth, where, you meet the family, right? And so a lot of it is really just like, what would that be like? What would the family dynamic be of here? Now you have an adult Mary, you have an adult Joseph, and they have an adult son who is supposed to be the son of God, but he's like 29 or 30. He thinks he's supposed to be the son of God, but he hasn't gotten the calling yet. You know what I mean? So he's just kind of hanging around and doing a little bit of work here and there, and everybody kind of digs him, but he's starting to have his own kind of doubt about, like, is this really going to happen, and when is it going to happen? And so it was really kind of fun playing with that kind of kind of failure to launch
Yeah.
dynamic.
Like the
Um,
Bible's written in third person mostly, and you're trying to tell it almost in a first person story or a second person story. Like you're in the room and they're having the conversation versus somebody just telling a story from afar.
yeah, I mean, it's third person, but it's very, very close. Almost everything's in the butcher's point of view, except for some visions. And, it's the things he witnesses. So it's very much like the Bible. He is a witness to these different people in Christ's, history, or Jesus's history. And it was just interesting to me to see, like, how driven someone can be. And you touch on zealotry and faith. I mean, because the butcher absolutely believes that what he is doing is the correct thing, and he's being called by God to do this, right? He is trying to prevent this age of fire and ash, right? Because the visions he's seeing are actually, of a nuclear holocaust that happens far in the future, right? So he is absolutely convinced that he has to do this, that this is the correct thing, and God is calling him to do this. And, how dangerous is that? How dangerous is a true believer, even if what they're trying to do isn't maybe as altruistic as it seems from the outside. And so it was really kind of fun to, here's a pious man who is looking for redemption, but is on this mission to kill. And we have certainly seen a number of examples of that in the news throughout the ages. So that was fun to explore. That was really fun to explore. So I
So
think
you didn't pre-censor yourself at all. You didn't worry about what anybody was going to think about it. You were just writing the story you wanted to write.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I don't really think about the audience until, like, that last draft, when it's just more for clarity of situation, right? Do we know what he's after in this section? What are the consequences of not getting it, right? It's very much just like, okay, if I'm reading it new, what's my roller coaster? Does this stall a little bit? Is there another little flavor thing I could add in here? Is this going to, which way is this going to push people, in their judgment of the main character? So it's really kind of that kind of tinkering happens like near the very end. And my last pass is just, cutting. I have a list of junk words from Dreyer's Guide to English that I just go through and I eliminate. Nobody starts off saying well or so,
Hmm.
about some, I get very specific, with the words. Because also you want it to read very clean and not contemporary.
Hmm. I was just, for some reason it popped into my head a contemporary analog to what you're doing. It's with things that are in the public domain, so to speak.
Hmm.
Winnie the Pooh became public domain, I think, last year, and someone made a horror movie about it. That
Blood and
Winnie,
honey.
yeah. So people are. It's interesting how people like with subjects that they're very very close to and very dear to them that you would think of as sacrosanct. You wouldn't want to mess with them, but yet people will do it.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the Butcher of Nazareth, like I said, is uh, very respectful of the Bible and the origin of that and the story and the characters, right? I just use them fictitiously and like, okay, let's do a deep dive. Let's see what happens. Uh, you know, Winnie the Pooh, yeah, public domain, but without the red shirt. But I think the red shirt version, which is Disney's, comes up this year or next year. Steamboat Willie is in the public domain. Disney's spending so much money trying to keep Mickey from hitting the public domain because it'll have been 100 years. Yeah, so I wouldn't say like I'm like, haha, Jesus is a slasher. 'Cause that's certainly not the case. Because then it's just, it's low hanging fruit, right?
Yeah, it's having those stories come into the public domain is really interesting, and it's almost an exercise when you look at them to think, well, what could you do with this that would be unique or cool. The what ifs of it, the speculative of it, but it's something that's been so static for for a century practically. And do you want to touch it, that kind of thing? Do you want to be the person who made Winnie the Pooh a murderer? So
I mean, at least they knew somebody was going to cover it in terms of reviews or the news and stuff. And I mean, and they just did Popeye too. And these movies were shot before they became public domain. So like the year they came public domain is when they were they got their distribution and came out. I mean, I really had no idea what the response would be. I still don't. I'm at that stage where I'm getting blurbs. Arcs have gone out, starting to get blurbs from other writers, and it's been overwhelmingly positive. We'll start going after more trade reviews, soon. And that's, you never know what you're going to get there. Kirkus was really nice to me the first two times. And this last time I sent him an earlier manuscript and, there were some good pull quotes, but you kind of felt like also like they didn't get it. And then, but it's subjective, so you can't argue with it. But I have found that having an introduction in each of my novels written by somebody smarter than me really sets the table for like what you're going to see, because people have, it gives them a little bit of like background and a little bit of like, hey, keep an eye out for this and that, and then people read it with an idea of like, do I agree with that or do I not? So they're really kind of not at sea when they start reading it, I think. And I think it's helped, and maybe that's a crutch for me as a writer, but that's okay.
Speaking of other writers, you mentioned before we started the podcast that you're working with a nonfiction writer. Are you editing? Do you edit, or what do you?
So I'm kind of like the de facto, or not de facto, I guess a de facto book scout for my publisher.
Oh,
And I'm a mentor for the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Association. So I mentor once a year. I mentor somebody, and I like mentoring. I thought it was teaching I love, but I actually love mentoring because you can actually kind of pick and choose. But there, every now and then, I'll come across a book or I'll come across somebody I'm mentoring that has something I think it would be really interesting, that would be a great fit with the tit, and usually it was with Whiskey Tit out of Vermont. And usually the deal I have with with Miette is, if I'm recommending a book, I will take it on as editor. Like
mm.
I will edit and get the book into shape because I believe in it that much. And that's kind of the litmus test for me. If I'm not willing to spend 6 months to a year helping somebody elevate the book or edit, then I won't recommend it.
So that's interesting. When you're reading other people's work, what stands out to you, even if you're like, it's a little rough, but with polish? What's really the thing that grabs you?
Uh, I different things. I'm mentoring one guy that I'm hoping to get across the finish line. It's just it's funny in kind of a Douglas Adams kind of way,
Okay.
but he's done his research and it's fun and the characters are really well drawn. and I think it could be kind of like, I consider more of like almost a fun beach read, which I usually don't go for, but I can read something. I'm kind of, okay, where would this fit in the canon? Where would this fit in our repertoire, so to speak? But the
Mhm.
one I'm working on now is Adam Axler is uh, is the author, and he was an EMT and a physician's assistant for about 20 years. He now sells vintage collectible science fiction books. Like, I have a whole bookcase full of wares that I've put his daughter through college with. Um, and he had written a kind of a memoir, but like little mini essays about different encounters he had. And Adam was an EMT at 9/11, and he was also one of the first PAs on the ground with Hurricane Katrina. And so he has written a number of essays, and they're reference to footnotes and stuff, just about healthcare in America and like what he has witnessed being on the front line. And I thought it was a really important book. I knew my publisher was moving into doing a little bit of nonfiction. I knew it would fit in with her mission statement, and and he's not a writer, right? So sometimes a lot of the stories read, let's say, like, read flat, but there's no build up. As they're not building up to a moment or a punchline or what have you. And because they're out of order, I was like, let's add a header of like when and where, the time wise, so we can kind of ping back and forth, because 9/11 and Katrina were relatively close back to back in his career, and you don't want to open with Katrina and 911. So it's like, okay, we're going to do these kind of out of order. We're going to resequence them. And so we have some pillars throughout, but we'll start or end with 9/11, and we'll start or end with Katrina. So you can just kind of see the shape of it, and he's willing to do the work. And if a writer is willing to do the work and listen, and not everything I say they have to do, but I'm like, hey, here's a suggestion. Is there any merit to doing it like this? Is there any merit to making sure you kind of do a self check-in in each chapter with, like, are you glad you're still in the medicine field? Like, what's your frustration level, right? So we can kind of get an emotional through line, even if it's out of chronological order. So you just, like, you see the potential, right? You can see what that end book might be. You can like, are other people going to respond to this like I did? And if only he had done this, that, and this, that I think we could have got it across the line. And so I recommend it to my publisher, and so look, I'll take it on as an editor, because I know she doesn't have the time. But that's really it. And it could be any genre, it could be any subject. I mean, excellent writing is excellent writing. A strong point of view that makes you stop and think, or gives you a new perspective, is worth championing.
Cool. Well, I think you're going to be challenging people's perspective with the new book coming out, The Butcher of Nazareth. When is that coming out?
We're going to start selling it this year. Actually, start this weekend
Oh, wow.
at AWP. But we're just, we're selling, we're getting rid of preview art copies. The official release won't be until February of 26.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Cool.
so we're doing a long lead up to it, and and just trying to spread awareness of the books, and kind of getting it at the a lot of booksellers, small publishers will do that. They'll sell ARCs at the book fest, because they're like, oh, this book won't be out for 6 months. Somebody might grab that one then, as opposed to something that's they can order off Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
Cool. Well, if people want to find you or your other books, where should they look?
You can find me at davidscotthay.com. That's my website. My publisher is Whiskey Tit, just spelled just like it sounds. And you can plug in my name, David Scott Hay, in there, and there'll be two books. There'll be Not Safe for Work, NSFW, and also The Fountain.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. This has been really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
So do check out David's website and his books, and check us out on social media at WG Therapy and writersgrouptherapy.com for all our other episodes. Until next time, we'll see you later.